I'm going to get started. Good evening and welcome everyone to the webinar Lessons from the 2022 National Strike in Ecuador, Voices of Indigenous Resistance. First of all, thank you for attending this webinar, which will provide a rare opportunity to hear directly from Indigenous voices in struggle in Ecuador. I'm Greg Wilpert of the Democratic Socialists of America, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. Before we get started, everyone needs to select the appropriate audio, that is the language. Please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen, that is of the Zoom screen, and select either English or the Spanish channel. I'll say this in Spanish too. Para seleccionar el audio apropiado, primero tienen que seleccionar un audio.
To select the appropriate language, you need to go to the lower part of the screen, the globe icon, and you can select the language of your preference.
Posted on the chat, written instructions in English and in Spanish on how to select your audio channel. If you're joining us via Facebook, the audio will be only in English. Also, if you select closed captions, those are also only in English. Tenemos instrucciones escritos en español y en inglés.
We have written instructions in the chat here in Zoom. So if you are connecting through Facebook, the audio is only available in English.
Continue now in English. This webinar is jointly organized by the International Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America and Code Pink. It is co-sponsored by the Task Force on the Americas and Chicago Alba Solidarity. For 18 days in June, the people of Ecuador led an indigenous protest and fought austerity to a halt. Tens of thousands barricaded highways, paralyzed the capital and much of the nation in Ecuador in protest of the neoliberal capitalist economic policies of Ecuador's right-wing president, Guillermo Lasso. The protests, known as a paro in Spanish in Ecuador, were led by the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, or CONAIE, and two smaller indigenous federations. Other sectors of Ecuadorian society gave support to the indigenous protesters, including unions, especially transportation workers, teachers, university students, environmentalists, feminists, and the urban and rural poor. Some joined in the protests. President Lasso called the protesters terrorists and anarchists. He had the president of CONAIE, Leonidas Iza, arrested at the beginning of the protests, although a court has not dismissed the charges. President Lasso directed the police and army to attack protesters violently in an attempt to disperse and intimidate them, hoping that they would give up and go home. Hundreds were injured and arrested, and 8 protesters were killed by state forces. The state repression did not work, and the protests continued to paralyze the country. President Lasso faced a vote in Ecuador's National Assembly to remove him from office. Lasso barely survived, even as a majority of representatives voted to remove him. That vote saw the main indigenous political party of Ecuador, Pachakutik, and the main progressive bloc led by the Citizens' Revolution of former President Rafael Correa. Those are two parties that are often at odds. They were voting together for the president's removal. Finally, after 18 days of protests and with vital supplies running out in cities due to road blockades, the government was forced to make key concessions and negotiate an agreement with protesters on their list of 10 demands. This webinar will present the voices of indigenous leaders and grassroots activists from CONAIE who participated in these historical protests. CONAIE is an umbrella organization that represents the country's 14 indigenous nations. Once again, to select the appropriate audio, please click the globe icon at the bottom right-hand part of your screen and select either the English or Spanish channel. Otra vez, para seleccionar el audio apropiado,
to select the audio that you want to hear, you can click on the lower part of the screen and you can select English or Spanish.
The panel tonight includes Floresimo Simbaña of CONAIE Communication, who will present an overall analysis of the protests, what happened, what was achieved, and what comes next. Simbaña has been a top leader of CONAIE and is a well-known and respected analyst and author. Our second speaker, Miguel Guaychico, is the recently elected president of UNORAC, a regional confederation of indigenous and peasant organizations in Imbabura province. He will speak to existing traditions and organizations and organizing in the communities that supported the paro. Also joining us are Kasha Rojas and Toa Tatuania, they are rank and file leaders from Imbabura province, a center of the indigenous movement. They will speak about the basic practicalities of organizing support, turnout, and logistics for the national strike, for marching in Quito and protesting within Quito and facing violent government repression. Finally, for those who might have joined late, again, my name is Greg Wilpert. I'll be moderating this webinar. I'm also co-chair of the Americas Subcommittee of DSA's Internationalism Committee. And as a quick side note, 4 years ago, I lived in Quito, Ecuador for 5 years, that is between 2014 and 2018, where I headed up the launch of the Telesur English websites. I don't consider myself an expert in Ecuador, but I definitely have an attachment to the country. So, to explain a little bit more about how we're going to proceed, the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to show a short video that was made especially by this for this webinar. So I'm going to ask Blair Goodman, who I think was going to launch the video, to share his screen, and we'll start with the video. Sorry, bear with us. Okay. Sorry, there's supposed to be sound, but we don't have any right now.
Blair, can you restart and activate with sound?
So we're just going to restart the video with sound this time, hopefully. There we go.
pasó?
Estamos soportando a la policía. Nos mandaron bombas lacrimógenas. Pero estamos para luchar. Somos un pueblo, somos de Chimborazo.
Poniendo los cartuchos de nuestros cuerpos, matando a la gente indígena.
Diciendo que somos el relevo, llegamos alrededor de unas 700 personas de este sector. Tenemos entendido de que de todo el país, de todas las provincias que tienen este problema, están ya convocados para llegar miles y miles de personas. Por eso hago saber de que solamente somos el relevo. La gente que está cansada tiene que ir a casa a descansar y llegamos nosotros para relevar en la lucha. No vamos a cansarnos. Si es que en 90 días el gobierno no nos da resultados positivos para la gente humilde, pues regresaremos a las calles.
Okay. So, thank you for the video. And so we're going to continue with our panelists. Unfortunately, two of them have, I think they tried to sign on and there seems to be a technical problem and they have not been able to make it. That is, our first speaker was going to be Florismilo Simbanya, and the other one is Miguel Guaychico, and neither one of them, unfortunately, has signed on yet, as far as I can tell. So I'm going to direct my first question actually to Kasia Rojas. She's one of the indigenous organizers in Imbabura province, and I just want to throw a general question towards you in terms of if you could just explain to us what is it that motivated you to begin organizing for the paro, for the strike. What were the issues that really stood out for you and motivated you to work on the strike?
Buenas noches con todos, ¿sí me escuchan?
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? First of all, we as members of the youth, we are fully aware of our reality, of the inequality that we are facing in our country, especially as indigenous people. We feel in our own skin the lack of access to education, to health, to economic progress. For that reason, as member of the youth, we decided to join this struggle because we are inspired by our ancestors who also fought, even losing their lives. Many lives were lost along the way. That is why we have great leaders that fought before us and set an example for us to be inspired and join this important struggle.
I want to ask maybe Toa Tituania. She's another organizer also in Imbabura province. If you could tell us maybe a little bit about your experience with the government's reaction to the strike. What did you have to face when you went out into the streets? What was going on for you?
¿Sí me escuchan? Buenas noches.
Can you hear me? Good evening. Well, with regards to your question, when we started to go to Quito, we realized that young people and the elderly, we realized about the racism. We realized that we were living behind the racism that used to be present in Ecuador, but racism didn't disappear. We started to face criticism by different people. Our children and our adolescents were criticized, and criticism were directed against us, and we were systematically attacked by the police forces and military officers. They were attacking not only physically, but they were targeting us with their words.
Now, when the government made concessions to the organizations, again, I just want to establish some of the context for the situation right now. What were the concessions and how have they advanced so far? Have you been able to see any negotiations and any concrete results come forward from the government so far? Kasia?
Bueno, para entrar en contexto,
Yes,
nosotros
to give you context, we are experiencing remarkable inflation in our country. Poverty was increasing, especially among the most vulnerable sector. This led people to take the streets, and many people didn't want to respect our right to protest. So they were saying, go back to your communities. You should not protest. And it's not only the right to protest. We needed to be heard by the government. After so much pressure, we were able to exercise because many sectors joined our pressure campaign. The government had to pay attention to our demands, and they tried to set these dialogue tables. So 90 days were given to create these tables of dialogue with the different sectors of society. These tables for dialogue are still being structured up to this moment, and agreements were signed. We have progressed, but nothing is defined until these agreements are truly materialized and honored. So that is why we need to continue struggling and fighting and making sure that the agreements that the government promised, because the government has promised things in the past as well, we need to make sure these agreements are honored in the future, respecting the times that have been set with the people involved, with the resources that the government is pledging to pay attention to the issues.
I want to go back to you, but actually this is a question for both of you, but let me start with Toa. When you started organizing for the strike, tell us, I mean, one of the title of this webinar is also lessons, from the strike. So I want to know a little bit more first about how did you organize the community? What did you have to do to get people involved?
Ya, hablando desde mi comunidad,
Well,
desde la
speaking with the members of my community, and specifically in my Asama community, we were first a small group of youngsters, because the elder people have been fighting continuously along the year for their voices to be heard and for the defense of the rights that we currently enjoy. They, at the beginning, disagreed with the idea of taking the streets. So we decided first, young people from the community to participate in a community assembly and call people to participate and go and take the streets, because we need our voices to be heard. And the elderly are familiar with the experiences that our community has undergone, and that is why we started to organize in our community. We have a organizational structure. We have a union that involves the ground movement and members of the community. So we started to conduct dialogues with different communities and different indigenous groups. And we decided to go to Quito, because those that were already in Quito, they were suffering attacks by the government. And that is why we wanted to provide support to those that were already in Quito.
I want to turn the same question to you. Can you add anything more to what Toa said about how you went about organizing your community and getting people involved in the strike?
Sí, bueno.
Yes.
Primero lo que se trataba
First, what we were trying to do was to convince people, explain them, why are we fighting for? What are going to be the achievements if we are part of this cause? And quite often, people were joining our efforts to express their solidarity, because, for example, you see your brother in the protest, but we were also going to each one of the communities. You were first talking to the members of your family, and then this capacity of making the members of the community to work together and approach other communities and approach the regions until we have a national group. So, and within this space, I have to mention that one of the strategies that worked very well for us was the use of the social media, because communication at a national level was suffering censorship. And everybody, for example, in the mainstream media, were supporting the government and not us. But local media and community media and social media had a key role to spread real information and what was the reality in the streets. So that was one of the strategies we implemented, communication in this, in order to call people to participate.
What we also would like to hear more about is the role of other organizations. Now, both of you represent indigenous organizations in Quito, particularly in Imbabura. But what was it like to, were you able actually to get in other organizations involved, such as unions, environmentalists, women's organizations? What was it like to try to get them involved, and to what extent were they mobilized as well? Again, let's alternate and go back to Toa first.
Ya, listo. Lo que es las organizaciones.
What these organizations did, for example, in our province, there is a main organization that connects with smaller organizations. What we did, we are in charge of the FICI, which is like a main organization, and we have that vision precisely to involve all the grassroots movements that have been fighting for years, and other organizations such as the organizations of women, environmental organizations, cultural and art organizations that decided to join us, but they had maybe a different approach. And they have a different approach with regards to these 10 demands, because they have different points of view, and we respect that. So we tried to hold a dialogue and say why these demands need to be met. And when we saw that most of the organizations that we tried to convince didn't agree with all of the demands, they decided to support us with blankets, food. They helped us partially, but they didn't want to get involved fully. Some organizations didn't share the same criterion we have.
Bueno, el neoliberalismo estaba
Neoliberalism was affecting us more and more in the different groups, and especially in the abandonment of vulnerable groups, women, children, sector of education and health, and the indigenous communities. And this was affecting the economy as a whole at a national level. Of course, the elites were not affected because they had never been affected, and they exploit the working class and the peasants. For this reason, many people were expressing solidarity and empathy towards us, but some other people were giving priority to their rights that were vulnerated, and their rights were lost. So they decided to join our effort. So some people were not convinced that we were on the right track, or maybe they didn't share our methods or the way we were conducting the protest. But when they started to see that some of our colleagues died, or that we were lacking food and we were resisting, then they started to be convinced that we were defending lawfully our rights. So this was the incentive for some people to finally join our efforts in their collectives and in their organizations. And even scholars that are aware that the government was not paying attention to our demands. That is why some of the sectors decided to join us.
The other thing I want to ask is, of course, one of the main ways that it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that one of the reasons the strike was a success was because it managed to interrupt the normal functioning of the country. And one way you achieved with this was actually by blocking major roads, such as the Pan American Highway. Talk a little bit about that experience. I don't know if you personally were involved in that, but if not, maybe from what you know, what happened. What was it like to organize a blockade of the highway, and how did you have to deal with the police forces or security forces in trying to remove you? Let's start this time with Kasia.
Ya, listo. Como
Yes.
mencionaba
As
anteriormente,
I was mentioning before, CONAIE works with different organizations in different villages. So there are different methodologies in the different communities. So at the moment, we were
de los puntos
trying to protect the strategic points for blocking the roads. There were rules on how to act. Each group had different rules, and we were helping each other. A group was at night, and another group was covering a different shift. So no space was left empty. Okay, so we were blocking the roads with tires, with trees. There were some communities that established like shifts of people to be there all the time in the road. That was a way to handle things, and it was a strategic manner so that the law enforcement was not able to kick away all this group of people together. In our province, they sent the government sent the military, but they were not able to send us away, because in these strategic points we have a lot of people there, and we have a channel of communication between the different organizations and communities. And we were saying to members of the other community, look, military are being sent there, let's provide support so that they are not sent away. So we had a strategic communication methodology. So we received support from different communities. So it became visible, the force of the community. It became visible that we are not alone, that we are not divided. Each person is like a corn grain, you know, that is part of a whole thing. Kasia? At a national level, there are strategic points that the TOA mentioned. So for example, these spaces in the north and in the south in which you see the main commercial exchanges. So these points needed in the roads needed to be blocked, and communities helped to do that. And so we were able to have a large amount of people. It was necessary to have a large amount of people when the police was coming, because police officers were less than the amount of people that we had. And so the police officers were not able to send us away because we were there resisting in large numbers. So when we were in the position of resistance, and the fact that the government heard our claims, is because we were able to take the whole city of Quito. During the first days, communities were protesting locally. So as Toa was mentioning, people from one community were supporting people from the other communities. And at the moment when the communities decided to go beyond their local places and decided to go to Quito, the true social pressure was faced by the government, and they ordered repression against the protesters. But this triggered at an international level visibility with regards to the massacre that took place in the capital of Ecuador, so that the government had to pay attention to our demands. And this would have been impossible without applying this strategy.
I want to turn to some questions from our audience, actually. So if anybody wants to ask a question, you can do that in the Q&A. It's in the bottom of your screen in the middle, it says Q&A. We have a couple questions submitted already, so I'm just going to start, and in the meantime, others can think of more questions. The first question we have from our audience comes from Paul Flansburgh. Has the government not lived up to agreements? Now, you started talking about that earlier, but if you can give us some more detail, to what extent has the government continued negotiations, and how do you plan on responding to the lack of response from the government? Let's start with you, Kasia.
Sí, ha sucedido varias veces que
It has happened several times that the government promises things and they sign agreements, but they don't honor the agreement. In that case, if that is the case, the situation becomes really complicated because we have people that have been wounded, people who have been killed, and society gets scared because some people are scared about the state. Instead of having the state protecting us, they repress us, they oppress us. So people were not convinced at the beginning of organizing a new strike. But if the government decides not to pay attention to the agreements and the demands, because now the agreements are being signed, they are signing agreements with the different sectors. So each party needs to honor the agreements reached. So if the agreements are not honored in the time set for them to be complied, society will need to organize once again and include other sectors from society that in the previous struggle abstained of fighting alongside with us. So we will try to have strategies to have less people wounded, but we will make sure that the government doesn't have disadvantage to escape their obligations.
If you could respond to this as well, but I'm also wondering if you could say something about how do you see people's motivation in your community to restart any kind of protest to put pressure again on the government? Do you think that's a likely situation to be coming soon if the government does not respond?
Ya. Actualmente se están realizando.
Currently, we are seeing the dialogue tables, but the President Lasso is not being serious about the solution of problems. He's kind of deaf, so he's not seeing the seriousness of the situation. And the community members and the organization members, when they see, so for example, we took the streets to raise our voices and to demand that promises are honored, but unfortunately, at least a dialogue table was set, and a high percentage of people didn't want that. So demands need to be honored, but in this dialogue table, these members of the different communities and the members of the unions don't want to take the streets again because they saw many people wounded, many people were killed, and simply everything ended up again in a dialogue table, and maybe the possibility of having the government not honoring their promises. And what has been said in the organization is if a new strike takes place, they will continue protesting, and when our proposals are taken into account, we will stop protesting, because we went with a purpose to protest. But what we saw was a lot of people killed and the demands were not met. And so people are losing enthusiasm about protesting. However, community members, we are together. We will always support our people because we belong to the same bloodline and to the same roots, and we will go out to the street and support the protest. But what we want to see is that the agreements are honored.
Let me go on to another question, and this ties actually into the previous one, which is in order to continue pressure on the government, you need to have a united movement, a united front. Now there's been mentioned that that some of the groups are maybe not quite in agreement. What is the situation at the moment? I mean, how difficult has it been to maintain unity within the forces that are opposing the Lasso government? Kasia?
Kasia. La pregunta es para Kasia.
Ya. Actualmente,
At present, each of the interested social sectors in the discussion initiatives, they are for negotiating with the government. That's difficult because there are many opinions, perspectives, including different levels of economy within the society. And many of the sectors are not having a common opinion. But in order to achieve that unity within these social sectors, is that the most needed people could be prioritized because they are pivotal, they are important. So if we take into account this, then we will continue tackling each of the demands. We will begin with the most needed people, then with the most interested people, then the compliance of the agreements, and then to call of the unity. So the government is not abusing anymore about its power because we know that they have the competence of the legislative power and they have the command of the law enforcement body. So basically, this is what we want to do, to make a call of these movements, regardless of their interests. The main idea is to stop the abuse of the government because the government must be stopped of attacking our society. Thank you.
Disculpe, ¿me podría repetir, por favor? No se traduce.
No,
can you repeat the question?
If you have anything to add to what Kasia said, but if not, that's okay. We can move on to the next question. Let me move on to the next question, which is, of course, the question that in order to...
Podemos continuar.
Sorry, okay. In order to...
Yes, we can continue.
Maintain pressure on the government, you need not only unity, but it also helps to expand one's base. And the question is basically if other classes in Ecuadorian society, that is upper middle class perhaps, are being won over to support your cause. I mean, what has the situation been? Has there been growing sympathy, or has it been more and more difficult? I mean, some of in our audience actually who are in Ecuador mentioned that there's been also a tremendous amount of racism in Ecuador that might have made your struggle more difficult. Racism against the indigenous population particularly. Can you talk about that? That is the extent to which more sectors might be won over versus to what extent has it been difficult because of racism? Toa?
Disculpe, ¿me podría repetir la pregunta? Mi internet está un poquito bajo.
Can you repeat the question because I have some?
It has been, if there has been any success in winning over other sectors of society, such as maybe the upper middle class or other sectors of society, or if the problem of racism has been particularly difficult to make, to win a larger coalition, a larger movement in the process of this struggle. Oops, we lost her completely. So yeah, her internet connection was weak. So Kasia, I'll turn to you. Can you answer that question?
Sí, bueno, nosotros tenemos una sociedad bastante
We
colonizada.
have a colonized society, so racism is surviving nowadays, and it is present in our daily lives, and it is existing and affecting in our lives. So in some circumstances, some sectors, they must take a decision of, so they must select a side. And this is how you can see the racism. And then you see that the white class and then the mestizos are excluded. So it is difficult to understand that we are a plurinational people, that we have rights, that our ancestors were living here even before the colonization. So in order to reflect and to create consciousness in the society, we must explain the essence of the protest, because if we are in a passive way, or perhaps to not make the people to feel uncomfortable, no, the idea is to move people in order to call people's attention, because the government must be feeling uncomfortable because of their, and then as a result, the government will be taking care of our demands. So this is basically what we want to do, and this is what we are doing with this rest of the society, with that society that is affected with this racism behavior. And those demands are taking into account the women's rights, the right to not be affected because of the violence. We are claiming, we are denouncing the rights of all of the sectors of the people, regardless of the levels of the society, because it is important to highlight that the high class of our society is just a minimum part of the society. So the idea is to move. And this issue of racism, it is focused, or it is a heritage, something that has to do with the European colonialism, and we must understand perfectly the essence of the plurinational concept that is established in our constitution. When we understand that, it is the moment in which we are going to cool down that racism issue that is affected, and this is part of the struggle that we are facing, and it is necessary to balance those inequalities that we have in our Ecuadorian society.
Another question that we have, and I mentioned this earlier, is that the president of CONAE, Leonidas Issa, was arrested by the government and tried to put him on trial, but a judge recently dismissed the charges. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that his arrest had on the movement and on your organizing efforts?
Sí, generalmente el gobierno culpa a cada
The
uno.
government is blaming the leaders because of the social disturbances, and they are not understanding the essence of the protest. So the president of CONAE was illegally detained. The officers were not having legal grounds to prosecute the president of CONAE. So this was a mistake committed by the government because at the beginning, there were some sectors that were not joining these demonstrations and there were not unity. Well, basically that fostered the unity of our brothers and sisters from the different communities and the nations and the sectors in our society. So when these illegitimate circumstances are taking place against a leader that is defending the rights of thousands of people in our country, so many people decided to join this cause. And then we increased the pressure and we were protesting against the government. And of course, the government was looking excuses just to blame us. The sin committed by our leader was to lead our communities, to defend our rights. It is necessary to highlight that in Ecuador, there is a high level of corruption, and sometimes this is hidden by the government or even by the judiciary in Ecuador. The authorities of the government, they are involved in scandals, they are involved in mismanagement, and there is not accountability for those citizens involved in such scandals. So this is why we need to counterface that this is something that we must claim and demand. So basically many leaders and communities decided to join our cause.
I'm glad you were able to connect again. I hope you can hear me all right. I just want to ask both of you, I don't know if this is a question that we actually had for one of the other panelists, so I'm not sure if you're prepared to respond to it, but there were 10 demands, 10 main demands. Can you just tell our audience what those demands are that you're still hoping to have the government fulfill? Either, I don't know who wants to go first, Toa or Kasha. Yeah.
Bueno, las 10 demandas
The 10 demands has to do with the interest of the entire society, including the middle class, the most needed for the entire population, and this has to do with the financing, with the interest of the banks. And once the pandemic has adjourned, well, there was a delay, there was a lack of commitment by the citizens with their banks. So one of these requests is to reduce the banking interest, the interest rate, and to provide better conditions for the most needed people. The second one has to do with greater investment to foster education, then for the intercultural and bilingual education, and not only in the communities, but also in the cities. Besides, we are requesting the importance of the environmental issues because there are many companies that are exploiting our natural resources. So there are many communities that are resisting against those activities, and the government is basically ignoring the demands of these communities that are rejecting these activities, because we are entitled to be informed about the activities of this nature. It is important to take into account the opinions of the citizens that are living in those communities. So these communities from the Amazonia, their rights are vulnerable, mainly because of the activities executed by the oil companies. It is necessary that those agreements must be signed by all the parties, and the other issue has to do with the health. We know that the neoliberal system is basically excluding the funds for guaranteeing health services for the most needed people. So the government must stop thinking about the trade with other countries abroad, and the government must think as a priority to provide health for the Ecuadorian people. Well, concerning the dialogue, the government has firmed these agreements to destine greater funds for education and health, and it is sitting as well in some parts, but of course they are not sitting, they are not changing their attitude in the most important issues. Well, the government, I need to say, that has signed some concrete points in the thematic groups. And as I said before, this is basically some piece of papers. Those are not promises, and there is no guarantee that those promises will be fulfilled in the future or in the terms established by the government. So we are waiting to include those demands in the thematic groups, and then let's see if the government will comply and to see how the government will do in order to guarantee the rights of the peoples, and how the government will not cede because the government has its neoliberal interest.
I just want to mention that we posted short versions of the 10 demands in the chat as well for people who want to see another summary. I just wanted to, we've got a couple more questions actually. I hope our panelists are okay, even though we only have 2 instead of the 4. We'll continue a little bit more, but I think we should probably wrap it up soon. I also want to, I want to ask a couple more questions before we do. But before I do those other questions, I just want to mention also that we have the DSA International Committee, has expressed its solidarity with the movement of, and we have the statement in the chat. And then also I want to mention that if people are interested in joining the DSA International Committee, we will post a link to that in the chat as well. And for those of you who aren't members already, it's just now got posted. So you can sign up there or learn more about the International Committee. So let me just move on to another question. Of course, one that's very important, and particularly considering that we have 2 women speakers, Indigenous women speakers here. It was mentioned earlier that the issue of women's rights is a central issue. I want to ask Toa maybe whether other women's organizations, to what extent have other women's organizations that are not Indigenous joined in this struggle, considering that women's rights is an issue for this movement?
Claro, al momento de salir
Yes,
nosotros a la...
at the moment of going to Quito, we certainly received the support of many women from different female organizations. And as we said, when we started to participate in the protests in Quito, we as women are in the front line. We are in the front line of the protests. So women from the women's organization from Quito and other provinces and other communities and other sectors, they decided to join this effort. And when we were attacked, we had more women there. We have women from the feminist group supporting us and defending us from the racist attacks we were receiving. And so there were groups that were supporting us, certainly, and continue to support us up to date.
The other thing I want to ask is, I'm going to combine, actually, this is going to be one of the last questions. I'm going to combine several questions in one, which have to do with the issue of international solidarity. That is, to what extent has international solidarity been played a role, and what kind of solidarity do you think has been effective and helpful for your movement? And how have you experienced that kind of solidarity? I mean, where has it come from what you know? Kasia first.
Ya, bueno, la solidaridad.
Well, solidarity started from our fellow communities nationwide. At the moment, this solidarity starts to be visible at a national level. Then the international community starts to realize what's going on in Ecuador. Why is this abuse taking place in Ecuador against people? So one of the elements I would highlight as an expression of international solidarity is that at an international level, news were broadcasted about what was going on in Ecuador and what was not shown in Ecuadorian media, because there was a media blackout because the national media outlets were sold out to the government. So the fact that international media outlets were paying attention to what was going on in Ecuador made other organizations, such as the United Nations, to realize about what was going on. They decided to send envoys and see what were the relations between the protesters and the government. So when international organizations decided to approach and explore what was going on and what conflict was taking place between the people and the government, well, the government started to receive pressure from abroad, and they had the obligation to pay attention to our demands, because it's not all, the government was not only receiving pressure internally from us, they were being pressured by international organizations. So the government started to be concerned about their reputation as government, as a state at an international level. So I think that helped a great deal. And also foreign solidarity that was expressed by means of economic resources that were sent to our organizations for us to continue our struggle, because we stopped working in order to protest. We stopped producing. We stopped having resources. So we needed resources. So several members of the international community, foreigners expressing solidarity, sent resources to us for us to continue standing firm in our struggle. So help is always welcome and is well received, especially when we are facing this severe crisis, because in the hard moments we had to live in our struggle, all help was useful for us. And the fact that people were able to express their solidarity, somehow this accelerated the temporary solution that we have seen because of this crisis, because the government was not going to pay attention to our demands otherwise.
I don't know if Toa and Kasia, if you turn on the Q&A button, the Q&A chat, you can see the last question. It says that I believe your audience would love to learn the words, and now I'm going to do a terrible disservice because I cannot, don't know how to pronounce this. Shuk Makila, Shuk Shunkula, Shuk Yayula. What that means, ignore my pronunciation. Why are they important to the indigenous resistance movements? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. En los movimientos
in our movement, we always use this word, shuk makia, shuk shunyuya, shuk shuyaya, one voice, one thought, one feast, 1 gram of corn, one struggle. And she's repeating some other words. If we are indigenous, if we are united, we will live and die indigenous. This is our phrase. This is what makes us feel strong when we are about to crumble. When we are on the edge of falling, there's always a brother or sister, a leader that starts saying this word. For us to remember, why are we here? Why are we struggling? Why are we sacrificing our own lives for the future generations?
Right. Well, I think we've come to an end. I think that's a perfect place for us to end. First of all, I really want to thank both Kasia Rojas and Toa Tituania so much for participating. They serve as an enormous inspiration. Young Indigenous leaders who are really have done an amazing job in explaining what was happening, and of course serving as a tremendous inspiration for all of us. So thank you so much for having joined us. I'm sorry that the other panelists were not able to join us. We have to see there must have been some kind of a technical problem, which is not unusual. I just want to remind people again, this was an event that was co-sponsored by the International Committee of DSA and also Code Pink, and also by the Task Force on the Americas and ALBA Solidarity Chicago. Lessons from the 2022 National Strike in Ecuador, Voices of Indigenous Resistance. Again, check out our website, which was in the chat. And thanks so much to everyone for having joined us for this truly inspiring panel. And have a good night. Yes, recording will be available.